Hello. If you're watching this video, it means I've died, or for whatever other reason I can't be with you in person today. But luckily, East Ayrshire Leisure, in association with the First Minister's Reading Challenge, have very kindly asked me to submit this video demonstration instead of one of my usual in-person workshops. So just to introduce myself, I'm Tom Foster. I'm a comic book artist. I draw Judge Dredd and other characters for 2000 AD and various comics publishers. And today I'm just going to be doing a little bit of drawing for you while answering some questions that I've been submitted through schools and on social media. But first, a word of warning. Vivacious and exciting a person as I may be away from the drawing board, when I'm actually working, the concentration required for successful drawing has a tendency to strip my personality of any nuance and leave me as kind of an empty husk, more machine than man, mechanically working through my duties while capable of only the simplest and most basic of conversations. So apologies if the following demonstration appears a little dry and technical. I'll do my best to keep my energy levels up as I go and be in some way interesting. But without any further ceremony, let's get on with the business of drawing. Right, so before we get started, let's just have a look at the tools I'm going to be using while I draw here. So first of all, this is what's called a clutch pencil. The lead is just like a regular pencil lead, but it comes in and out of this container here. It means that I don't have to buy complete new pencils every time and waste all that wood by sharpening them down. And it's got a nice weight and everything and a nice grip, so it's very comfortable to hold. These cost about, well, they're a bit more expensive than regular pencils. One of these cases here is usually somewhere between 10 and 15 pounds. And the leads, the replacement leads, come in a pack like this, and that's about the same price for those as for the holder thing. But these will last a very long time. Even working every day with these as I do, I won't run out of pencil lead for, probably quite a few months. So they'll keep me going. I sharpen it with one of these. This is a kind of a drum sharpener. I pop the pencil in, rotate it around. It gives me a nice, brush the little graphite shavings away. It gives me an incredibly fine point on the pencil. A little pro tip for you. These drum sharpeners here, the brand you'll find most easily is the Stapler one. But the bottom part of this one's actually from a different brand called Linex. The Stapler ones tend to break quite easily. Mine would break normally after just a few weeks of using them because the little bit in the middle that sharpens the pencil has a tendency to break off under the pressure of constant use. But this Linex drum here has a nice sort of solid metal support in the middle which keeps it in place. But the top from the Stapler one tends to give you a nice smooth action and a clean point there. So there you go. Right, so that's the sharpener out of the way. The paper I'm using is called Bristol board. It's quite expensive as well for as paper goes, but that allows you. It's got a nice smooth surface. You can rub out pencil lines, a number of times and still have a nice surface to draw on. Unlike cartridge paper or printer paper, which tends to get very kind of muddy and tends to lose its surface after having pencil lines rubbed away. So I'm going to start in pencil, and then so that it's clearer to see and because it more closely resembles finished comic book art, I'm going to move on to using some pens. So these are the types of pens I'll be using. They're sort of fine liner pens. Microns and these Winsor & Newton fine liners here. Now I'll use these normally when I'm putting together a comic book page just for doing straight lines with a ruler or for doing some very fine details. Most of the time I'll use a brush like this. But because that's quite time consuming, dipping it in ink and taking off the excess with a cloth and washing the brush every time, I'll just be using a pen because it's a bit quicker and because it's less likely to smudge while I'm working here. I'll just show you before I get started the kind of stuff that I do when I'm at home. This is a comic book page here, one of my Judge Dredd ones. And most of the inking on this is done with one of those brushes, but all this sort of detail in the background that's been, that's sort of very straight geometric stuff, that's been done usually with one of those pens and a ruler. But I'll just be using the pens today. But this is kind of a reasonably good example of what's a finished comic book page looks like once I'm done with it, and then a colorist will go in and put in the color. Sometimes I color my own, but usually somebody else does it. So let's get started. I believe the first character I've been asked to draw, I got quite a few requests, so I've just narrowed it down to a few just to keep things kind of going relatively quickly. So the first character that I'm going to be drawing is Emma Frost from the X-Men, also known as the White Queen. And like I say, I'm just going to start off in pencil and talk a little bit about how I kind of construct the head and later the figure with some of the future characters, and then maybe talk about how I go about designing stuff. But just to start with, let's start off with the head. So when I'm constructing things, I particularly when it comes to things like human anatomy that are quite complicated, I like to think in terms of a sphere or a ball shape as the starting point for most things, because it looks the same regardless of what angle you look at it from. And then when you're drawing in comics, you tend to have to draw things kind of from unusual angles and in unusual positions. So I tend to start with just a straightforward circle shape and use that as the basis of the top of the skull for drawing a head. Then I'll kind of split it in half like this, like that, just to give me a center line for the middle of the face, both vertically and horizontally. Then from there, I draw a straight line down, or mostly straight, curving a little bit inward towards the bottom, for the bottom of the chin. Now this center line here, that's going to be where our eyebrows sit, and just below that, have another one for the eyes. So this is going to be kind of the middle of the brow here. And then I have another little kind of curved line going around, crossing at the midpoint between the top of the head and that brow line there. And that's going to be kind of the start of the hairline, where the hair meets the face. Then about the same amount down, again, that's going to be the bottom of the nose, and that's going to be where the chin is. So I'll round this off, connect these up, and this is going to be the jawline. Bring it up to roughly where this center ellipse here touches the edge of the sphere. That's going to be the side of the face. There. So you can already see we've got kind of the brain case of the skull here roughed in, and we've got something that's looks a little bit like a face starting to appear. No features yet, but we'll get to that. Okay, so the head, at the top of the head at the moment, is looking a little bit bulbous. So for where the temples are, just kind of shave a little side off of the sphere there, and kind of imagine that's happening on both sides there. Just bring that in a little bit. bring the neck out from the bottom here as well. Okay, so let's start on the features. We got one eye here and one eye here. They tend to be about another eye's width apart. And the nose going to be here. And then halfway between the nose and the chin, we're going to have our mouth. Chin's actually looking a little long at the bottom there. Okay. So that's kind of basically, there's the eyebrows there on the eyebrow line. That's how I construct kind of the basis of the head. Now at this point I'm going to stop talking about exactly what I'm doing as I do it. I'm going to start answering some of the more general questions that have been submitted. So first of all, we got a question from Jack who asks, what's your favorite thing to draw? Well, in terms of just everyday things, my favorite thing probably is the face and head. Gives me an opportunity to sort of try and put a lot of character into things. And here, I'm trying to kind of inject as much of a personality into the character as possible, while at the same time, with sort of superhero characters, they have to be kind of usually quite sort of stoic and not have too much expression in their face, because they're, you know, constantly steely and reserved and brave. But with other types of characters, I'll usually try and put as much kind of unusual character into them as possible. In terms of the themes of things that I like to draw, generally I like sort of superheroes and science fiction, stuff like that. Very kind of dramatic, dynamic things. I do like drawing more kind of everyday domestic stuff as well, because it can be quite restful and satisfying to look at. But nothing kind of gets you more excited about drawing than drawing something very unusual or otherworldly. Got another question here from Marissa. Do you like quiet to work, or do you listen to music or podcasts? If so, what do you listen to? Well, generally, obviously right now I'm not having anything on in the background so that you can hear me speak, but generally I'll listen to podcasts, or lately I've been listening to audiobooks. The audiobooks I tend to listen to tend to just be kind of adventure stories, Sherlock Holmes, that kind of thing. And the podcasts, I tend to listen to a lot of comedy podcasts while I'm working. But often I'll just put on some music while I work. Some artists swear by listening to classical music while they work because it kind of helps them concentrate. Generally, I'll listen to usually some kind of piano-based music, but something that's quite kind of bluesy and you know, kind of restful but still fun to listen to. Now this jaw's looking a little bit too angular here. The Emma Frost is quite a sort of graceful character and she has quite dynamic features, but there is a kind of softness and elegance to them as well. So I'm going to tone this jawline down a little bit. Not that I'm for a minute suggesting, of course, that the way people physically look is any reflection on their kind of personality or the amount of grace or virtue that they might have. But when you're dealing in the kind of very literal language of comics, you tend to find yourself making characters visually represent as much as possible what their underlying personality is. Now I just rubbing out the pencil lines here and leaving a kind of very faint impression of them so that I can work over the top and kind of simplify stuff without all of those construction lines getting in my way. His eyes were working okay, so I'll just kind of fill them in a little bit. Let's take another question. So I've got a question here from Black Plague on Twitter. He submitted quite a few questions, so I might go back to that well a few times. He asks, do you prefer doing cover art or interiors? Now, for those who don't sort of speak the comics language necessarily, interiors is basically like what I showed you before, a comics page with multiple panels on it that would be used for telling the story. The covers are just what they sound like, the cover or the front page of a comic. And I'm not honestly sure which I prefer. I think there's something very satisfying about working on the storytelling process of doing comics pages. But covers, because they're the first thing people see, which is something I'm going to come back to in a later question, but because it's the first thing people see and because it's just one image, you really get a chance to focus on it and do your absolute best work. Whereas with full comics pages, you find yourself having to draw so many different things and figures and different scenes and backgrounds in the one page that can kind of limit the amount of time you have to focus on any one thing. So on the whole, I mean, I draw fewer covers anyway, so there is kind of a novelty to doing that. I think probably I do prefer doing covers in general, but I'm glad I'm not just a cover artist. I like working on comics pages, and they do tend to get you better at drawing faster, precisely because you're drawing so many things so quickly. Let's see, what else have we got here? What are your thoughts on the current state of comics in the UK and America? Well, I'm afraid I'm not necessarily the most qualified person to ask about that. Outside of the comics that I personally work on, I don't always get a huge amount of time to read many for myself, which, I mean, I enjoy reading comics a great deal, so I kind of wish I did have more time to read. But I find that most of my comic book reading tends to be very kind of fitting in very, very occasionally, just before I go to sleep or anything. So as to the state of the comics of comics in the UK and America, I don't think quality wise there's necessarily any issues there. I think there's a lot of great artists and great writers doing a very good job. I think things are changing a bit at the moment in terms of comics creators and publishers are trying to develop a bit, become a bit more progressive, which I think is laudable. You know, as society changes, the art tends to have to change to represent that, and also a lot of people have been kind of underrepresented and disserviced by all kinds of media up until this point. So I think it's a good thing that things are changing. I don't know if they'll ever be 100% perfect, but hopefully that process will continue to evolve and improve as time goes on. As to the business side of it, well, I mean, at the moment, or at least certainly over the last 10, 15 years or so, comics characters and franchises have been kind of front and center in pop culture, and there's been a lot of films and video games and everything that have been inspired by them, or directly developed from them. So comics have been kind of very much a product that needed to be, or has needed to be, kind of wheeled out in vast quantities and as quickly as possible to capitalize on the fact that these characters are so popular at the moment, or certainly have been very popular in the last few years. And I think that has had an effect on the way that comics are produced. There tends to be a greater emphasis on writers and artists who work very quickly and can get work out that is very on brand and very recognizable as a Marvel product or a DC product, or whatever company is responsible for it. And I think that there's been that's been a bit of a double-edged sword. I think the emphasis has been on sort of marketing and stuff rather than necessarily kind of creative freedom. But then that can also produce, restrictions can produce better artwork anyway, and better stories. So I think you just get a kind of different type of thing depending on the circumstances in which it's produced. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years, maybe as superhero movies and things start to get a little less prevalent and other things start to dominate pop culture. Be interesting to see what happens to comics, if there's maybe a greater emphasis on creator-owned material or more experimental things. But either way, I'm quite happy. I enjoy doing all types of projects. I'm not too fussy, really. Right, okay, so we got most of the head kind of roughed in here. Obviously, the character is currently bald, but that's fine. We're going to resolve that. The hair is generally the last thing about the head that I'll focus on, because I want to make sure the actual shape of the head is right first before I put any hair on it. Maybe make that ear just a little bit smaller. There we go. And tone that jaw down again. There we are. Now let's find the hairline. So there, I did mark in very lightly the halfway point between the brow line and the top of the head. That's where our hairline's going to start. And it's going to peak off kind of at the top of the temple there, come down at right angles. And that's going to represent where the hair meets the head. It might not necessarily be the lowest point that the hair reaches, because obviously with long flowing locks they tend to tumble down the side of the face and over the forehead. But that gives us a kind of organic root from which to bring the hair out from. Let's have another question while we're working on this. What other companies do you want to work for? Well, that's a difficult question to answer in some ways. I'm very happy working with 2000 AD. I have no complaints at all in that regard. Obviously, it's nice to spread your wings as much as possible, and I do like working on superhero titles and things, so I'm very much open for business, but I don't want to give the impression that in any way I'm stifled at all. I'm having a very, very good time drawing Judge Dredd comics and the like, and I wouldn't want to minimize that in any way at all. Right, okay, let's get the pupils of the eyes in. There we go. Right. Let's see if we got another question here. Oh, here we go. This is quite relevant. I like that a lot of the characters you draw have unique looking faces. Is that something you've been doing intentionally? As I know, a common criticism of comic artists is that they draw characters with the same face. Well, now this one I'm drawing is kind of a sort of archetypal superheroic type face with you know, just the right combination of kind of dignity and poise. But generally, I do like drawing kind of more unusual character types, as I said before, who maybe have kind of older faces or more expressive faces. Because, well, I feel like that is maybe a slightly underdeveloped quality in illustration. Sometimes you tend to draw archetypes and kind of very specific types of characters so often that it's nice to see a bit of variety, and also a little bit of I try and make the faces that I draw as kind of anatomically realistic as possible, even if they are quite unusual. So that's kind of a fun challenge, and drawing a realistic, expressive face is very kind of rewarding. Okay, right, so let's get the hair in there. Now, I have got, one of the questions I got was about the importance of using reference. I'll see if I can find it. Let's see. Well, I can't find the exact question here, but basically it was just about the importance of using reference material when you're drawing. Basically, that just means, you know, finding pictures and things of that already exist, photographs or other people's work, to make sure that what you're drawing is kind of accurate and correct. And that is very important. I mean, I will often use extensive reference material. One of my favorite books I've got here, these are a series of books of photo reference, just of lots of different faces from different angles, different facial expressions, sometimes different lighting, different ages of people. And these are really good because they're in black and white, and obviously I tend to work in black and white, so that kind of makes things a little bit easier for me. But also just the sheer volume of material there give me a lot to draw from, no pun intended. And when you're drawing human anatomy, trying to, as much as some comic book artists claim that they can completely visualize the human body from whatever angle without using any reference material, usually you'll find that there is some detail or other that you're less confident with, that can help from just a little bit of demonstration, whether it's in a photograph or looking at another piece of artwork or whatever. Obviously, it's best not to copy other people's artwork wholesale. That's considered to be very bad practice in comics or, you know, any other industry, I suppose. But just for a bit of inspiration or to correct a little bit of anatomy that you might have gotten wrong, it can be very useful. Sorry, it's losing control over the shape of this mouth for some reason. Okay. All right. Now I've got some reference here, in fact, of this character, Emma Frost. I looked some up beforehand, just to make sure I had a strong idea of what she looks like. And she's got this kind of collar thing. With white fur that comes off at the sides, and a cape comes down. I won't draw too much into the figure, just so that I've still got room left on the page for doing other drawings. But yes, so in short, reference is very important. Some people use 3D models. I used to use a lot of 3D digital computer models to try and get my proportions on my anatomy as correct as possible, but I found that after a while my drawing ability wasn't really improving because I wasn't having to construct stuff from scratch. But if you're already a fairly kind of experienced artist, then they can be useful as a way of either speeding up your process or making it more consistent. But if you're starting out, I think it is important to try and develop your skills as much as possible early on, because they're ultimately what's going to get you the work in the long run. Okay, these eyebrows here. The hair seems to be kind of, she has quite loose and expressive hair. All right, soften up this. That cheekbone's going down a bit low. Again, that chin. It's always a nightmare trying to tell exactly how far down your jawbone should go just to get the right level of combination of sort of strength and definition without appearing too kind of brutish. Okay, that's gonna do it for this rough pencil. Now I'll go over in pen. In the meantime, let's have a question. Let's see. Explain shading, how it creates the illusion of form, texture, and depth, and the use of varying thicknesses of line for similar ends. Now that might sound like quite a technical question, I suppose it is, but shading and line weights and things are integral to the success of comic book art. Generally, because you're working in 2 dimensions, you have to sort of artificially boost how 3-dimensional something looks, and there's all kinds of ways you can get around that. And shading is obviously one of them, because having shadow or strong shadows on one side of an object and very white light on the other can give it a sense of having kind of form and being 3-dimensional. But like just having this little shadow underneath the chin here can really help give a sense that it physically kind of occupies space and is blocking light. And line weights, in other words, how kind of thick or heavy a line is, can play quite an important role in that as well, because it's just a very subtle way of suggesting shadow and depth, even when you're just drawing the outline of an object rather than the details. But for areas that are more exposed to the light, actually let's use an even thinner pen here. This is a very thin nib. This allows me to work in those lighter details very precisely. I'll probably thicken up this line under the nose here, just because it will be casting a little bit of a shadow down onto the rest of the face. All right, so work in those eyes as well. Since I've got the fine liner out. Okay. Sometimes it's handy just to use a very fine line to pick out the details, just so that you've got a nice clean drawing, and then you can go in and sort of thicken up a few of the lines as you go, and that'll bring out the dimension. So here, I'm just going in and putting a very thin line around everything. And then I'll go in and thicken some of these lines up. Put a little bit of shading under the top lip there, just to give it a sense of jutting out a little bit over the bottom. Maybe get some thicker lashes on those eyes. Right, so we're starting to get reasonably good face going here. So here, I really am just using the different weights of line to give a sense of shadow and depth on the face. Let's bring in the kind of top line of that collar a little bit. Maybe even use a slightly thicker pen for that. Let's see if we've got any more questions here. Some artists I've spoken to have certain subjects which they either dislike intensely or find difficult. Do you have anything like that? Basically, sort of things that I hate or having to draw or dread seeing in a script in case I have to draw it. Well, I mean, the classic one is animals, horses, things like that. And they can be a little frustrating, mostly because as a comic book artist or an illustrator of any kind, you tend to find yourself drawing the human figure an awful lot. And because of that, you tend to spend a lot of time studying it and, looking at art books about constructing the figure and doing life drawing classes and things like that. So you become pretty familiar with it generally. And the human figure is such a complicated thing to draw and has so many different kind of moving parts that it is difficult to get very good at it. It takes artists, often the first 5-10 years of their career just to really get confident at drawing the figure. And then every so often you'll get asked to draw an animal of some kind, and it will usually, unless you're an artist who draws a lot of kind of American Westerns or other themes that use animals regularly, you find that you're drawing something that's just as complicated as a human, but which you've spent next to no time studying, and you have to learn to draw it pretty much from scratch. Now, there's some overlap in terms of human anatomy and animal anatomy, obviously, but for the most part, the proportions are completely different, the character of it is completely different, and it can be a bit daunting, and you tend to be a bit disappointed when the results aren't consistent with the quality of your drawings of people. But it makes sense that it wouldn't be in a lot of ways. And in a situation like that, reference material and the way you use reference material is incredibly important. Having good photographs to work from and maybe even some actually visiting a zoo or a pet shop or something that'll get you up close with particular animals can be very helpful just to fill in the gaps in your own knowledge and enable you to almost bluff your way into drawing something that looks consistent with the rest of your work, even although you've spent far less time studying it. And that's not just true of animals. In comics, that's true of a lot of stuff, types of buildings, vehicles. That's when you really need to get on the sort of image search or on the, on the internet, or get some books with some good pictures in them, just to expand your kind of visual vocabulary, the things that you're confident drawing. Okay, so we're these tufts, these kind of furry tufts at the side are giving a sense of massive shoulders, which aren't necessarily there. So let's put in just a little bit of the shoulder at the top of the cape here, just so that those big tufts don't actually represent the underlying figure. So there's kind of the top of the cape there. It's like a few little kind of shadow lines around the chin. I've just kind of roughed the hair in. I've not spent too long on it. Typically, if I was drawing this for a comic, I would spend quite a bit of time on the hair because it can be quite an expressive and useful device, if nothing else, just for giving a sense of not only depth, but you can use it to help the composition of your image, because those strands of hair can basically be kind of flying anywhere in any direction, and not as rigid as the features of the face. So you can use them to create a more kind of compelling or interesting looking image. But here I'm just kind of suggesting them rather than drawing them fully. Just a little scribble to suggest some kind of background. Make the face stand out a little bit more. Okay. So that is a very kind of rough approximation of Emma Frost. So let's move on to another one. I was asked to draw my favourite fictional bear. Actually, there was another question attached to that as well, so maybe I should answer that question first. Oh yeah, what is my process to design the front page of a comic book, because it's usually the one most people see? Well, I'm just going to rub out these pencil lines here, or some of them anyway, so that you can get a better sense of how this might look as a kind of finished piece of art. Still very rough, but you know. So, first of all, my favourite fictional bear. Well, I had to think about this, and to be honest, it took a while for me to even realise that I had any kind of favourite. There's so many fictional bears, but I didn't really have a particular preference. But I think the one I'm going to go for is a character called Robert Bill from Thundercats. I don't know if he counts as a bear. He's sort of partly a robot, but I got a picture of him here to work from. So I'll try my best to draw him. So in terms of designing a cover for a comic, it can be quite different from how you think about telling a story in the kind of on the inside pages of a comic, because there's a lot of things to take into consideration when you're drawing a comic book page. Each panel or each individual image on the page has to kind of do a number of different things at once. It has to work on its own, but it also has to work with all the other images on the page. But there usually has to be kind of a variety of different types of angles and shots and, close-ups and mid-shots and landscapes and things on a comic book page just to keep it visually interesting. But when you're dealing with just one, you really have the option to create something that is kind of the best possible standalone image that doesn't really have any other constraints on it. Now, a lot of people will take a scene that happens in the comic and use that as the basis. And that's usually a good idea because it's sort of fair advertising as to what people are going to get on the inside. Generally, though, when I'm doing covers, I try and create an image that's more kind of like a publicity shot, like a photo, like a movie poster, not necessarily something that actually happens in the movie, but something that kind of represents the movie. And I try and think in the same terms when I'm drawing comics. So I'll maybe just choose one character or one object or a combination of the two that appear in the story and draw them in a more of a kind of isolated way, not necessarily in any particular setting or scene or realistic lighting condition, more like something that's just been set up specifically for that one particular image. And I find that can be quite effective. Having characters actually looking directly at the kind of camera, if you like, is something that tends to be more unique to covers, like addressing the reader. That's not something you can get away with on the interior of any comic unless it's maybe a Deadpool comic or a cartoon strip. Right. Well, this is Robert Bill here. He's someone that comes into contact with the Thundercats quite a lot. Resident of Third Earth. He's basically just a big fuzzy ball. There we go. Right, go over him in pen as well. And we'll get another question on the go. How long can a single page take to render? Asks Artemis on Facebook. Well, that's a bit of a sticky question because by render, they basically just mean draw. The rendering process, like rendering is basically this process, what I'm doing here, the kind of final brush strokes or pen strokes on something. And that would basically be, I guess, the inking stage where I go over all the original drawings in ink. And that's, that can be quite time consuming. That can take anywhere between, for me anyway, it can take anywhere between maybe a day and 2 days, depending on how complicated the scene is. But from start to finish, drawing a comic book page, it varies wildly depending on the artist. I take a long time. I'm kind of notoriously slow. So from initial rough drawing through to finished inks, my pages, can take, about 4 days to do, sometimes even longer, because I'll spend the first day doing a very rough version of it, and then I'll trace it using this thing here, just a light pad on my drawing board, so I can, if I put another piece underneath, you will see another of my Judge Dredd pages, so I can very faintly see the page underneath here, and I would take my very rough drawing and I would trace that and then clean it up for my finished pencils, and then I would make a scan. I would scan it, print it out, and ink over the top of that, and that would be my the finished version. So the rough pencils can take about a day for me. The finished pencils can take anywhere between 1 and 2 days, and then the inks usually take about a day or sometimes a little bit longer than that. But then I'm very slow. There's artists who can produce, 2 fully inked pages in a day. That's unusual, but there are some of them. There's an artist called PJ Holden, who's another 2000 AD artist who works incredibly quickly. But it's just a question of, preference, really. There's no one right amount of time. The industry standard is considered to be, penciling about a page a day or inking about a page a day, because most of the duties are split up between multiple people. You'll have a penciler and an inker and a colorist. Colorists quite often work a little bit faster, maybe do a couple of pages a day or sometimes even more, but it depends. I mean, that's not standardized. There's a lot of different approaches, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. Taking more time has its benefits. You get to stick to a slightly more kind of realistic style or be a bit more of a perfectionist. But if you work quickly, then that tends to be good for earning money, and also for getting full stories done in a decent amount of time. It can be quite grueling to be working on the same story for, months at a time, when a faster artist might be able to get a full comic done, 22 pages in, less than a month. Whereas I'm lucky if I can get 6 pages done in that time. Right, okay, so Robert Bill's coming together here. I'm going to use, I don't have one handy. Normally for this circle for the nose, because it's kind of a perfect unbroken circle, I would normally use a template, which is basically a sheet of plastic with holes cut in it, perfect circles. Use that, just like drawing around a cup or, around a CD to get a perfect circle. But they're all different sizes, so they do help as an inking tool. But just since I don't have one next to me, I'll do my best to draw it freehand. Apologies if it goes a bit skew. Right, let's take another question while I'm doing that. Let's see. What's your favorite piece of your own work and of someone else's? Well, my favorite piece of my own work is always changing. It's usually whatever piece I'm currently working on, because I will always be convinced, usually, that whatever I'm working on at any given moment is the best thing I've ever done. And it rarely is. Usually it's somewhere in the middle. But very occasionally there'll be a piece that stands out as being, as still being among the best, even after I've finished it. And there's a couple of those. There's a commission I did of the Angel Gang, which is a family of very unpleasant people in the Judge Dredd universe, and that one I do really like. You'll probably be able to see that quite soon on my Instagram or on my Twitter feed. I haven't put it up yet. I'm waiting for the right moment. But the first Judge Dredd cover I did, I do quite like as well. Partly just because a lot of other people, that seemed to be their favourite piece of mine, and that's fair enough. You know, it was stronger than a lot of other stuff I'd done at the time, and it stood out. So I do like that one. And also it was probably one of the better drawings that I'd done at that time. But then I took a lot of time over it. It was the first professional cover I'd done, and at one point I even completely restarted the inking stage. I started inking it, decided I wasn't happy, and started again. Just started the inking again on another copy of the pencils. And yeah, turned out okay. I like that one. But I'm constantly trying to top it. You know, I never try and get too happy with any piece of my own work, because then the temptation would be to just kind of think, well, that's it. I've arrived. I've done it. I'm not going to get any better. And that's not the best attitude to have when you're working in the creative industry, because before you know it, someone else comes along who is still trying to get better, and they succeed, and you're out of a job. It's not as cutthroat as I make it sound, the comics industry. Generally, that we're quite sort of supportive of each other and stuff, but underlying all the time is that sense that, you know, it can't last forever. Right, what's next? Okay, so I've got a drawing of Deathstroke to do next. Now, I'm just going to quickly check the time on this and see how we're doing. Okay, so we're coming up to the hour mark now. So this will probably be the last one that I do. And, well, actually, I'll maybe just fit in one more at the end. Anyway, I'm going to take this sheet of paper and I'm going to move it up a little bit so we've got a bit more space to work. Just use some masking tape. All right. Okay. So I'll just use Deathstroke as an opportunity to quickly talk about constructing the figure. So, like I say, when I start out constructing humans, I tend to like to think in terms of a sphere or ball shape, just because, like I say, it looks the same from any angle. So I will usually make a start with the head there, just the top of the skull as a kind of ball, and that, in my mind, will be roughly the size of a melon. And then I'll kind of build in a bit of a stick figure coming out of there. Roughing in the joints and things. And the proportion of the joints is the other thing that I pay the most attention to at this stage. So the shoulder joints and the hip joints I think of as being about kind of golf ball sized, maybe a little bit bigger, plum sized. Then the elbow joints, about the size of a tennis ball compared to the melon of the skull. And then the knee, about the size of maybe a softball or an apple, a little bit bigger than an apple. That's not a very interesting pose, is it? Just standing there. Let's have that leg bent a little bit. And this arm up like that. Maybe that's about it at the moment, I think. Right. I'll roughen the rib cage there. The head, this figure of a sort of superhero type figure is generally about kind of somewhere between 8 and 9 heads tall. This isn't a full head, obviously, that's just the top of the skull, so bring in that jawline as well. That's about the size of your head there. So I'll just kind of roughly, I won't always actually draw on these guidelines, but try and get space out about 8 heads of height there. Okay, so the third one down here is going to be where the rib cage ends. Fourth one down will be where the pelvis sort of comes to a stop. Fourth, fifth, sixth, that'll be the bottom of the knees. That pose isn't good at all, is it? Let's, you know what, let's bring this leg out to the side. It's going to be more visually interesting. Have the legs splayed a little bit. Maybe this arm coming out a wider angle. Okay, that's maybe going to be a little bit more interesting. So yeah, those human proportions, I mean, a lot of anatomy books, particularly books on illustration and things, will give you good guides for proportions of the human figure. I don't want to go into it in too much detail here because of the limited time, but they're very handy to know. Right, just using anatomical knowledge built up from years of studying anatomy books and things to build in the muscles and things. The skeleton is basically that stick figure underneath. See if we've got another question here while I'm constructing this figure. What's the biggest concern for you when designing a new character? Well, there's a few little kind of main considerations when designing a character. The classic thing for cartoonists, rather than necessarily comic book artists, is whether or not a character is recognizable by their silhouette. So things like, you know, Mickey Mouse and Bart Simpson and all those kind of characters, you can tell who they are even if you're just seeing their shadow, basically their outline, and that's quite a good guide for if your character is distinctive. And there's other considerations when you're drawing in kind of more realistic characters. You have to take into consideration what kind of person they are, what that might say about, you know, what kind of proportions they have. You know, if they're somebody who's very physically fit, obviously they're probably going to be more muscular. If they're very if they're supposed to be very strong, then they'll be more bulky as opposed to being kind of lithe and athletic looking. But in terms of actual like costume design and things, I'd say color balance can be quite important. You don't want to have too many competing colors. Maybe, you know, one kind of main color, a sort of secondary color to kind of give an accent to things, and then maybe a mid-tone or a black or a white tone, just for kind of details and things. But you also, like, giving a character a sort of reasonably strong motif or theme can be important as well. And how closely, if you think of superheroes and stuff, like somebody like Spider-Man, thematically, he's got themes, spider themes in his costume. He's, you know, got the webbing and the kind of less human looking eye slits and stuff. But his costume doesn't look like a spider. He's got a spider on his chest, but that's about it, and on his back. But he's not shaped like a spider. He doesn't have 8 legs or anything. He leaves that to Dr. Octopus. There are just themes of spider stuff in his costume. Whereas if you take somebody like Batman, Batman has more features in common with a bat. He has this big cape for the wings. He's got the sort of bat ears. He's all black. Or I suppose blue and grey in the old comics. But, you know, he is meant to resemble a bat rather than just having a bat symbol on his chest, which he also has. So that works quite well because Batman is supposed to be an intimidating figure, whereas Spider-Man's really more of a kind of, well, he's a friendly neighborhood character, isn't he? So you wouldn't want him to be too frightening and spider-like. Right, okay. How's this figure going? Well, it's a wee bit ropey, to be honest. The proportions are a little off. Pelvis is a little low at this stage. Okay, so I'm just going to rub out that figure. Oh, incidentally, I haven't really talked about the erasing tools that I'm using. Obviously, this is just a standard eraser, just a regular rubber that you'd get from a stationer's or whatever. But these two here, kind of mechanical ones. Very small one here. It's basically just like a mechanical pencil as a refill. Comes in and out. These are about a $5. And there's this one here, which is kind of a square block. You can find these pretty easily online and in art shops and everything. But I like them because they give me a very fine detail when I'm erasing, so I can erase bits of character's hair without obliterating a whole section of their face in the process. Okay. So, okay, this is looking a little bit better now. Tightening up the proportions a little bit as I go, just because I can see everything a little bit more clearly without the construction lines. Those construction lines when you're drawing, basically just the lines where I've mapped in the proportions of the character and stuff as I start. Those can be a bit of a double-edged sword because you can use them as a guide, but at the same time, they tend to make stuff look well proportioned even when it's not. Just because they kind of are a demarcation of the different points on the anatomy. So they look kind of technical and realistic, even if they're not really 100% in the right place. Right, I think I need to bring those shoulders down a little bit as well. See, I started so well. I was mapping out the proportions of my character. I was trying to be as accurate as possible. And in the end, I'm just kind of winging it a little bit. There is a lot of that in my day. Generally, when I'm working on comics, I'll realize that the proportions I've mapped out don't work. And I need to just kind of eyeball it. That's where experience comes in. And having done it for so long, you just develop a sense of what looks correct. That's often better than when you're actually doing things the right way and sort of more scientifically. Not that this is necessarily going to look that much better. I'll do my best. All right. Okay. There we go. He's getting there. He's getting there. All right, let's bring my reference up. I'm going to have a picture at the side of Deathstroke just to remind myself of what he looks like. His costume and stuff. Alright, so he's got that split down the middle of the face. I remembered that bit. And he's got kind of pouches that come down. And shoulder guards. And he's a bit complex, isn't he? More shoulder guard here, the eyes. Let's have that stick thing of his there. And maybe a gun of some kind here. Why would he be holding it like that? That makes no sense. All right, let's just make it a hand. Okay, pouches. Right, let's get another question while I'm working on this. I'll try and switch between my reference material and this drawing here. Oh yeah, no, my favorite piece of somebody else's work. I forgot to. I got so wrapped up in talking about my own work, I didn't answer my favorite piece of somebody else's. Well, I suppose, all things considered, my favorite piece of somebody else's work would be The Killing Joke, the Alan Moore and Brian Bolland graphic novel. I mean, no offense, Alan, mostly for the illustration. I'm sure he wouldn't be offended by that because he doesn't particularly like that comic himself. I mean, I do think it's a good and well-written story, but in terms of the artwork, it's probably the single biggest inspiration to my art style. He did a lot of good work on Judge Dredd as well, Brian Bolland, before that, and that's also a big inspiration. He's done a lot of Batman covers and Superman covers and Wonder Woman covers and things that are great too, but The Killing Joke is just one of those all-time classics. Gil Kane and John Romita's collaboration on Amazing Spider-Man back in the late 60s and early 70s was another big one for me. Their art's so kind of clean and they really get the look of Spider-Man just perfect between the two of them. Cover for each other very well. Get each other's strengths right, but also compensate for the very few slight weaknesses that they each have. Right, okay. Okay, so that's kind of a bit of a rough figure, but I don't know if I can be bothered doing all of the details of the costume. I'll maybe just use a ruler quickly for this staff of his. I'm just going to suggest it more than actually fully draw it. Just have a kind of standard looking staff. Right, well, while I'm inking that, let's see if there's another question. What are some important things you've learned about being a comic artist while you were doing work for 2000 AD? Well, I still am doing work for 2000 AD, so that use of the past tense is maybe a bit premature. But otherwise, well, let's see. Sorry, question goes on. Would you say you improved a lot as an artist? What else would you want to improve on as an artist? And which artists have influenced you the most? Well, try and work through that. Starting from what lessons I've learned while doing work for 2000 AD. Well, I guess, I mean, I've learned just about every lesson I have learned with my work for 2000 AD. I guess the first lesson I learned was you don't have forever to do the work. You know, you've got to find a way to try and produce work regularly to a fairly high standard and on time, and that took quite a while for me to learn. Like I say, I'm a pretty slow artist, and I haven't always been great at managing my time. I was always a lot more concerned with how perfect I thought it looked in the end, rather than how long it took me. And that's not a very considerate approach when you're dealing with an editor who's given you a chance. You need to be prepared to kind of meet their needs. And in some ways, I was glad that I gave myself a little bit of leeway in that respect, because it meant that I produced work that I liked, and that was very important to me. But I think if I've learned one lesson about all that, it's that if you try and produce work just a little bit more quickly than you're necessarily comfortable with, you tend to improve quickly as well, because you are, just through the sheer volume of work you're producing, you're having to draw more things, you get more practice at drawing different things, instead of trying to get one drawing absolutely right and perfect. You have to just keep beginning the process of drawing over and over again. And that's quite often more valuable when it comes to learning. But they were very patient with me. And I'll be eternally grateful for that. That was another thing I learned or that I have learned just in general while I've been working for 2000 AD, is that editors are not your enemies necessarily. They're not like a boss who's there just to give you a hard time. They're actually a very important part of the creative process. And as long as they are respectful, which my editors very typically have been, of the fact that some pages will take longer than others and some projects will take longer than others, they can actually be kind of a godsend, because they keep you on track and they keep you focused, and they give you someone that you don't want to disappoint. And that can be very important, because if you're just working for yourself the whole time, your standards tend to slip a little bit, because you tend to either get a bit complacent or a bit bored, and you stop worrying about what other people are going to think of the work. And I know that sounds like a good thing. It sounds like very liberating, but you kind of need to be worrying about what other people are going to think of the work a little bit, because you want them to buy it and you want editors to commission it. So if you're not at least a little bit worried about what other people are going to think of it, then you might find yourself out of a job quite quickly. Right. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into too much more detail on this Deathstroke image, because I want to fit one quick one in before I wrap this up. I've gone a little bit longer than I intended to, but that's okay. I can always either edit it down or get a little bit extra value for your money. Right, just roughing the hand there. Okay. It's a very kind of rough looking Deathstroke. I will draw the feet. I'm not one of those artists who's afraid to draw feet. I'll do it. I mean, I'll do it badly, but I will do it. All right, there you go. That's a very, very, very rough Deathstroke. Right, now the last thing I'm going to draw, somebody asked me if I could draw an Axolotl Superhero, which I've never done before. So let's see if I can answer that question about character design while I'm doing that. An axolotl is a very happy looking creature, so it's going to be difficult to make them look kind of dramatic. But why should I worry about making them look dramatic? when they're so lovely to look at. And they're a very odd looking animal, but they're also very pleasing. Little eyes there. And I'll give them, typically when you're drawing superheroes that are based on animals or like animal based, you want to give them slightly more human proportions. Axolotls do have those kind of big hand claw things. So I'll try and incorporate that into the design. I mean, I'm completely making this up as I go here. I've got some pictures of axolotls at the side here, but I have no idea how this little person is going to turn out at all. All right, so we need to give them some kind of costume. Just an axolotl ain't going to cut it. Let's give them a bit of a jawline. Right, so this big kind of, these fronds that stick up out of the back can be kind of more of a collar for this character. But maybe build into a cape, a bit like Doctor Strange's cape. Top of the head there, a little shadow on the head. Let's give them a slightly more muscular, superheroic set of proportions. Now, I know I said before about drawing animals being the bane of a comic book artist's existence if they're not used to drawing those particular animals. But in this instance, it's actually quite fun. Okay. You're not familiar with the axolotl. It's a marine creature, underwater. I mean, I don't know if maybe they can survive on land. I believe they're kind of a bit of an evolutionary anomaly in that they're kind of on the edge of evolution and in the process of kind of turning into salamanders. But I haven't read up as extensively as I might have on the subject. Apologies for not doing my due diligence. Okay. Okay, let's give him a bit more of a collar. I mean, I'm really going to have to keep the smile on the face because I never really see an axolotl without a smile. Right, and these are kind of thorny branches come out of these protuberance. If you've never seen an axolotl, I do recommend looking them up. It will improve your day. Okay, and you need a little. I'll need a little. You got a little leotard on there. He'll need some kind of superhero crest on his chest, won't he? Well, let's just put a big A. Alright, I know that's not very imaginative, but it's the best I can do. Right. Okay. Let's get some ink lines on there just to finish him up. While I'm doing that, I'll see if I've got a couple of final questions I can answer. How many different rules are there in producing a single page for a comic book, and which is your favorite? Well, like I say, art duties tend to be split up primarily between a penciler who does the initial drawings, an inker who goes over them either in ink or digitally in black and white using a graphics tablet or similar device. A colorist who, obviously adds the color, usually digitally these days. And there's a letterer as well. They add all the speech bubbles and thought bubbles, word balloons, I suppose, rather than speech bubble is kind of the preferred term, I think. And usually add sound effects. Sometimes the penciler and inker will do sound effect text themselves, but more often than not the letterer does it. And well, obviously there's a writer as well, but if we're just talking about the visuals of the page, then it's mostly those four people. Some people do the whole thing themselves. Some people do penciling and inking. Some people do penciling, inking, and colouring. Just depends on the project. I have, at some point or another, professionally done penciling, inking, and colouring. I've not done lettering professionally, although I did some on some sample pages that I did for publishers and things before I started getting work. My favourite, penciling is probably my favourite because it's maybe the most expressive. You have more control. You're starting with an empty page, which for the first while of your career can be quite daunting, but after a while you begin to kind of appreciate the empty page, because at that point there's not a single line that you're not basically kind of making up as you go along, whereas once you get into the inking stage and stuff, you kind of bound to whatever has already been put in place in one way or another. You can interpret it a bit, but for the most part, you kind of have to stick to what's on the page already. So I like the freedom of penciling. And also it's where usually the penciling stage is when you can tell if a drawing's working or not. Sometimes you can add something at the ink stage that wasn't there at all on the original pencils, but usually the pencils, for someone like me who does both inking and penciling myself and doesn't have another person in the process, if a page isn't working at the pencils, it's generally not going to work at the inks. And so if a page is working at the pencils, then it's quite kind of your work, so much of your work's already done as an inker, because all you got to do is try and make it look as good as you did already. So half the battle is done. So penciling's probably my favourite. Inking is satisfying because you get a finished, or a black and white anyway, finished page at the end of it, and you can kind of do a sigh of relief. Colouring is maybe the most relaxing in some ways, because there are still problems to solve, particularly if you're doing digital colour, you can kind of solve those problems just by running through various options of like, well, does a warm tone work here? Does a red work here? Does a blue work here? And you can kind of switch from one to the other fairly easily. Whereas in penciling, most of the big questions are, how do I draw a foot or something like that? And that can take an eternity to answer, with various attempts going wrong. But the colouring, because you can fill a whole area with colour quite quickly and get quite a strong effect, there's something very satisfying and therapeutic about it. So short answer, pencils, but also all of the others? Thank you, Artemis, for asking. Maybe one more question before I wrap up here. Okay, yeah, here we go. Mark Blameyer asks, can I ask, given the government's latest advice, can you explain why training to be an artist or a musician or actor or dancer is far greater than becoming a cyber? Now, that might sound like a very political question, and in some ways it is, obviously, and it's tempting to give a very political answer, but actually I don't think a political answer would necessarily be all that much use to somebody who's sitting at home thinking, right, well, in the middle of a massive health crisis, when jobs in the arts are not necessarily particularly secure, not that they always were at the best of times, is there any point in starting out in a creative career? Now, generally, my answer to that question would be a pretty straightforward one, which is yes, absolutely. For a number of reasons. First of all, the health crisis isn't going to last forever. Secondly, you'll generally find that the biggest appetite for things, particularly artistic things, comes when people have been denied them for a long time. So, there probably will be quite a big appetite for, live music and art exhibitions and things. And when the coronavirus crisis is resolved to the extent where people can gather in public without limits on the amount of people. But also, I know a lot of people whose jobs have become insecure as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And they are not exclusively artists by any means. In fact, I have been working steadily since the coronavirus pandemic started because I can work from home. I've always worked from home when it comes to working in comics. And people can order the comic online and everything, or still, for the most part, go into a shop to buy it. So fingers crossed, my job hasn't really suffered as a result of the pandemic. Whereas people who work in jobs that were, up until this point, considered to be quite secure, are finding themselves in quite a difficult position. So you never know kind of how the chips are going to fall with stuff like that. People think of the arts as being an insecure profession, or a number of insecure professions, when in fact, having your own kind of trade that you can do, even if you're not getting employment directly from, a publisher or a venue or whatever, can be very useful in insecure financial times, because you have the option of, doing private commissions and things like that. So you can usually eke out a living in some way or another. Whereas if I'd still been working in a bar, as I was before I got a job in comics, then there's a very strong chance that I'd be at the very least worried about being laid off in the near future. So, it just goes to show you, at least if you pursue the line of work that you enjoy doing the most and you think you'll be the happiest with, then you've at least got that going for you. Given the completely arbitrary nature of what is going to be not completely arbitrary, but unpredictable nature of what is going to be a secure career path in the future. So do what you think you do best, or what you're going to get the most enjoyment out of, would be my advice. And if it doesn't work out, well, then you can get doing a job doing something you don't like. But why not at least try and get the thing you want to do first? Because otherwise you're just going to wonder what it would have been like if you had. And you don't want to end up doing a job that you hate for the rest of your life. Anyway, that seems as appropriate a note as any to wrap up these drawings on. So I will leave it at that for the time being. I hope you've enjoyed watching these come to life. Well, that's it. Thanks for joining me. I'd also like to thank East Ayrshire Leisure again, and the First Minister's Reading Challenge for making this possible, and of course all of you for tolerating it in the first place. So it just remains to say thank you very much. Hopefully we'll be able to do one of these talks in person at some point, but until then, take care and happy drawing.